Hey everybody, it's Mr. Schwartz. It is Memorial Day, and before I go out and enjoy the beautiful weather, I wanted to fire off this quick video to you. I hope you're all finding a time to enjoy your day off. Get to it. What I want you to do this week is to watch this video and complete assignment 2, the classical conditioning activity, if you've not done so already. This video is going to be a walkthrough of assignment 2. So this will help you complete that assignment or understand that assignment if you did it and maybe you were a little confused. There's another classical conditioning assignment due, which is the classical conditioning worksheet, and there will be a video walking through the classical conditioning worksheet. That's going to be really good practice to prepare you for the classical conditioning quiz. So between these two videos and these two assignments, hopefully you'll be able to come prepared to our next in-person Google Classroom video session with some questions for a review for the quiz that's due at the end of the week. As always, any questions, concerns, issues, please email me at mrschwartz42@gmail.com. So what I want to do is I want to walk you through how we might look at the classical conditioning assignment that was due based upon the Little Albert experiment. For reference, the assignment that I'm talking about is the one that looks like this. So what I'm going to do is talk about the Little Albert experiment and then complete this worksheet based upon the information in the Little Albert experiment. Okay? So the Little Albert experiment was conducted by John Watson and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner. John Watson's a really famous name in the field of behaviorism. And one of the reasons why this experiment was groundbreaking is because it built upon the ideas that were presented by Pavlov in his experiment with his dogs. Remember, Pavlov fed the dogs, which caused them to salivate, and then he rang the bell, and then eventually the bell would cause the dogs to salivate. That's classical conditioning. In the Little Albert experiment, Watson and Rayner demonstrated that those same principles of classical conditioning and learning by association could actually work on humans as well. What they did in the Little Albert experiment was they took a small child around 9 months of age and they exposed him to any number of different stimuli. A white rat, I believe it was a stuffed rabbit, it could have been a real animal, a mask, a burning newspaper apparently, and they observed his reactions. Now initially, the baby didn't show any fear to any of the objects that he was shown. Perhaps he showed a preference to one or the other, but fear was not part of his response. Meaning that the objects that he was shown were, each one could be called a neutral stimulus. And we know from Pavlov's experiments that a neutral stimulus produces no associated response. In Pavlov's experiment, the neutral stimulus was the bell. In this experiment, the neutral stimulus is, say, the white rat, because that's the one that they then re-exposed him to. They show the baby the white rat, the baby doesn't have much of a reaction. Later, Watson presented Albert with the rat and then banged on a metal pipe with a hammer, causing a really loud, really disturbing noise. That upset Albert, it scared him, and it caused him to cry. In this instance, then, banging on the loud noise is the unconditioned stimulus. There is no learning that is required to react with fear, that startle response, and then start crying when presented with a stimulus like banging on a metal pipe with a hammer. It causes the natural response, which means it's the unconditioned stimulus producing the unconditioned response. In Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus was the food, and the unconditioned response was salivating. Remember, natural and neutral are very, very, very different things in this instance, okay? The natural response is the unconditioned response, okay? So neutral stimulus doesn't produce much of a response at all. If we're talking about a natural response, we're talking about an unconditioned response. The natural response to being startled, if you're a 9-month-old baby, is to cry. The natural response to being presented with food, if you're a dog, is to salivate. These are the unconditioned responses to be named unconditioned stimuli. Okay? So Albert learned to be afraid of the rat because he associated it with the sound of banging the metal pipe with the hammer. Eventually, with enough exposures, when Albert was presented with the rat, he just started to cry before there was ever any sound. Here's what that looks like in the language of classical conditioning. Remember, these terms at the top are the key terms: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Okay? Banging with a hammer, the unconditioned stimulus results in the unconditioned response of crying. The neutral stimulus, the rat, doesn't produce much of a response at all. When the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, there in step B, what we get is still the unconditioned response because the child is still, at this point, reacting to the sound of the hammer. In time, when the child has learned, the child will cry when presented with the rat, which means the rat has become a conditioned stimulus. No longer is it a neutral stimulus. It has become a conditioned stimulus. The child has been conditioned to associate the rat with the sound of the hammer and therefore responds in a conditioned way by crying when merely exposed to the rat. Okay? This information will be here for you in the PowerPoint slide. What I want to do now is open up the assignment and fill out the assignment as I would like. Now, here in the example, you have the terms again highlighted at the top, and you also have Pavlov's experiment as an example. Okay? So, for the Baby Albert experiment, the unconditioned stimulus, remember, it wasn't what was presented first. What was presented first were the neutral stimuli. The unconditioned stimulus was the hammer banging on the pipe, meaning the unconditioned response was fear and crying. Remember, the neutral stimulus was, let's say in this case, it was, I don't know why it's made there, whatever. The neutral stimulus in this case was the white rat. And the response to the neutral stimulus, not much. Not much of anything. Certainly no fear. In the conditioning trial, the unconditioned stimulus is paired with the neutral stimulus. Well, what's the unconditioned stimulus? The hammer banging. And hammer banging plus the neutral stimulus, the white rat, okay, the unconditioned stimulus, the hammer banging, plus the neutral stimulus, the white rat, results in fear and crying, which is still the response. After conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is what used to be the neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus has become the conditioned stimulus. So the neutral stimulus, which has become the conditioned stimulus, is the white rat. And the response, which is now the conditioned response, because it happens in response to the conditioned stimulus, is fear and crying. Okay? So let's just take a look at this. Let it soak in. The hammer banging is the unconditioned stimulus, abbreviated US, sometimes UCS, unconditioned. The unconditioned response, UCR, fear, crying. Neutral stimulus, the white rat, doesn't produce much of a response, certainly not fear or crying. Then during the learning phase, we pair the unconditioned stimulus with the neutral stimulus, which still produces the unconditioned response due to the presence of the unconditioned stimulus. The hammer banging plus the white rat results in fear and crying because of the hammer banging. Later, we know that baby Albert has learned to associate the white rat with that feeling of fear, because when we present the white rat, the baby starts to cry. When this occurs after conditioning, the formerly neutral stimulus has now become the conditioned stimulus. The white rat presented by itself produces the formerly unconditioned response, which is now a conditioned response. The white rat by itself produces fear and crying. Neutral stimulus has become the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response has become a conditioned response. Okay? That's all. That's all I wanted you to do for assignment 2, the classical conditioning activity. So this could be an example from your own life, or just an example that you think up. Some people, for example, when the phone rings, they get a pit of anxiety in the stomach because the only people that call them are when they get in trouble, something like that. Then you have to break it down and diagram it this way: how the unconditioned stimulus, when paired with a neutral stimulus, produces a conditioned response. All right, I will leave it at this, so longer than necessary. Please remember the rest of the things that you have to do, including watching the next video, which will start to walk you through the classical conditioning worksheet. Classical conditioning worksheet is going to be practice and preparation for the classical conditioning quiz, which is all going to be due at the end of this week. All right. I will see you over at assignment 3, and have a happy Memorial Day. Or rather, I hope you had a happy Memorial Day, because you're going to see this afterwards.